Those who walk on water reside in the realm of mythology. What you are is a follower of Eusebius. It's in the gospel.
A reading from the article, Did the Johannine Community Exist? By the theologian Hugo Mendez from 2020. If we can no longer reconstruct the external world of the Johannines from their narrative worlds, a new history of these texts must be written. That history should begin with a single individual, an author who drew on various sources, including the Synoptics, to compose a new gospel. His knowledge of the Synoptics indicated that he lived no earlier than the end of the 1st century. The conclusion to his gospel, in turn, suggests his aim. He wrote to advance the idea that eternal life, a state linked to the age to come in the Synoptics, is available now to those who believe. That was a reading from Hugo Mendez. In the past 30 years, the general public has become more educated about many different topics. Nutrition and exercise immediately come to mind. Compare how everyday people talk about those subjects now to how they talked about them 30 years ago. There's the negative impact of smoking. There's meditation and mindfulness, weather and climate, race relations, the education of children. We could go on for hours highlighting all the changes that have happened. Certainly not among everyone, but the discourse has generally become more sophisticated in these areas. And that extends to the field of history as well. I mean, how many more millions of people are aware of Stoicism because of a TikTok, whereas in the 1990s there were maybe like 5 people on Earth who had even heard of Stoicism? Dinosaurs. If you do an image search for dinosaurs with feathers, you'll find thousands of results. If you did the same image search 30 years ago, you would hardly get any results. You'd find more images of a dinosaur wearing a red flannel shirt than a dinosaur having feathers. So the general public can become more educated, and that often begins with the efforts of trained specialists like academics who publicize their findings and try to reach a popular audience. But when it comes to the origins of Christianity and the historical Jesus, what has the general public learned about those subjects since, let's say, the time of the Jesus Seminar? How has their understanding been advanced in any way? Because right now, the general perception of Jesus is basically this. He was a wise teacher, and what was significant about him was that he was truly unhypocritically good. He always did the right thing, and he served as an example for us to be consistently good within our own lives. Jesus was like Diogenes, but Jesus was the Diogenes who exemplified love and loving your neighbor, as opposed to the real Diogenes who exemplified being an asshole. And that's why Christianity can be summed up in one statement. What would Jesus do? And what would Jesus do is more of a riddle than a question. I mean, it's more of like a hexagram from the I Ching that you're just supposed to reflect on, because you already know what Jesus would do. He would do the thing that helps others, even if it inconvenienced or harmed himself. Go and do likewise. Some of what the New Testament says about Jesus is true, but not all of it. A lot of it was made up. Now, Jesus did really get executed, and the reason we know that is because, it's self-evident. Anyone who tells the truth and says things that no one wants to hear, we know that they always end up getting, at a minimum rejected, but often eliminated and killed. The Christian church would go on to invent stories about Jesus and attribute fake teachings and quotes to him that, he'd never actually spoken in real life. And they suppress the truth about him because that's what an institution like the church does just by its very nature. And Dead Sea Scrolls. Always got to throw in a mention of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In what capacity, the average person can never really say. They just know to say Dead Sea Scrolls. As far as I could tell, they think that the Dead Sea Scrolls are like books and scrolls about the real teachings of Jesus that the church overlooked when it was destroying all the genuine accounts of his life. And so organized religion has made it impossible for us to really know anything about the historical Jesus in the end. If you ask an everyday person to quote a saying of Jesus other than turn the other cheek, they're very likely to come back with either, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," or, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And these quotes are so well known because they show what Jesus was all about. He was all about love at the exclusion of everything else. They also happen to be quotes that generations of text critics have confirmed are secondary additions to the Gospels. In other words, they're some of the very same fabricated teachings of Jesus that the general public claims to be upset about. So this is the state of the case, and every so often some grifter comes out with a book about Jesus having an affair with Mary Magdalene or something, and it has just a huge impact. And that's when the theologians like to complain about the recurring cyclical interest that the masses have in this so-called secret life of Jesus and his romantic affairs. And they say that that stuff is ultimately based on nothing. It's just because some opportunist wanted to get publicity and they wrote about an ancient heretical book that scholars have already known about for 2,000 years, and they just repackaged it and hyped it up. But the theologians talk about all this like they're casual observers, but this is their wheelhouse. We can see that there's a substantial need for public education on these topics, so what have the biblical scholars been doing this whole time? Well, as it turns out, they haven't been idle. On the contrary, they've been very hard at work, but they've been working on quite a different project than educating all of us about the origins of Christianity. Our reading today was from Hugo Mendez, and I referenced this same paper in the opening segment of episode 33, at the very beginning of our John miniseries, when we covered legendary accretion. What he's specifically arguing is that the Gospel of John and the 3 letters of John don't actually go back to a self-contained community, and they are also forgeries, and that their authors are misrepresenting themselves as implied eyewitnesses of Jesus. And from the excerpt from earlier, you might have seen that he agrees with at least the basic principle of this miniseries, which is that the author of the Gospel of John knew the synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. He said that explicitly. And a bit later on, he even said that John used Mark as a template. But this paper of his was very significant. When it first came out, Bart Ehrman, who teaches at the same university as Hugo Mendez, was praising and promoting this thing all day long, and in an almost uncharacteristic fashion, I would say. I mean, Bart Ehrman is a man who sat on a stage 10 feet away from someone who said the words, "We have secretly discovered a first-century Mark, and it will be published in the near future," and he showed hardly any physical reaction to hearing that, as if the guy had just been talking about how, we exceeded the 5-year plan for bobby pin production. And then when it was his turn to talk, since this happened in a debate, he said in like a total deadpan voice, "I'll trust this first-century Mark when I see it, and when I see who published it. It could have been Donald Duck who published it for all I know." So you gotta get up pretty early in the morning to impress this gentleman. Yet he reacted to this Hugo Mendez paper like he was showing SpongeBob levels of enthusiasm for this thing. He called it very serious and persuasive scholarship, and he said that it has huge implications for our understanding of early Christianity. Saint Candida herself, our patron saint, she promoted Hugo Mendez's paper in the Daily Beast in an article called "Everyone's Favorite Gospel is a Forgery." Now, before anyone points out that the contributor doesn't necessarily choose the headline, here's something from the article itself. Quote, "New research which claims that the Gospel of John is an ancient forgery is poised to overturn much of what we know about everyone's favorite biography of Jesus." And the article contains no qualifying statements about how the guy might be wrong or nothing that takes exception to the term forgery. No, she says that the paper is provocative and well argued, and she brings in quotes from other luminaries in biblical studies who had nice things to say about it, including someone from Yale Divinity School. Now, the paper itself, "Did the Johannine Community Exist?" is a good one, and I encourage anyone to read it, and that's not me being ironic. But if you do check it out, don't be discouraged if you're unable to figure out what's so novel and so groundbreaking about it, and why these usually very careful and deliberate and image-conscious mainstream biblical scholars are so enthusiastic in their praise of it. Especially because it reads like it was written by a radical critic. It's the kind of thing they usually hate. It actually kind of reminds me of that paper by Robert M. Price, Antioch's Aftershocks, which I have never heard them say anything positive about that one. Now, Hugo Mendez, he does incorporate some recent findings from literary criticism, but beyond that, it's not like he's relying on new archaeological discoveries or manuscript discoveries or really anything technical that only a specialist would understand. He's really just reading the text and explaining them in a somewhat more skeptical way than usual. I mean, I feel that if Bart Ehrman and these others love this paper, I know an excellent podcast that they could check out. It does the exact same thing, but it goes actually even further with the skepticism. But to understand why such prominent scholars were so enamored with this thing, we have to go back to that question from before about what exactly the mainstream theologians have been doing with their time, since they obviously don't care about educating the public. And what they've been doing is fighting a war. The forever war against the conservative and evangelical and fundamentalist view of Christianity. And we've talked about the forever war many times. It's the war over whose version of Christianity gets to be considered normative in the public sphere. The conservative scholars are fighting on behalf of pious churchgoers against modernity and secularism. The mainstream scholars are fighting for liberal Christians against fundamentalism. It is a war that cannot be won, but it does keep everyone who's involved in it relevant and employed. And there are many battlefronts in the Forever War, but mainly the engagements or skirmishes come in the form of interviews, talking head segments or panels. You got the debates, and then there's publications, and that can be anything from provocative editorials to guest blogs to social media posts to academic articles, journal articles. And generally, the theologians on either side are trying to use these means of engagement to stake out positions on Christianity or the New Testament that resonate with their side and then defend them. For example, there's a line in 1 Corinthians that says, "Let the women be silent in the churches." Most liberal scholars think it's an interpolation. Most conservatives think it's original to the text and written by Paul. The liberal scholars represent a large population of Christians for whom a statement like that in 1 Corinthians is extremely troubling. The conservatives represent a large population of Christians for whom the presence of interpolations in the Bible is troubling. And so this kind of thing is what they fight over. And it often ends up dictating what their opinions are on these things to begin with, which side they're on. And I think that this concept of the forever war is the only reason for these mainstream scholars being so keen to endorse this paper that it goes so far as to call the Gospel of John a forgery, and it says that the author is engaging in inventions and fabrications. They're signaling that they're about to adopt a new strategy as it relates to the Gospel of John, which is the favorite gospel of most Christians, but is especially important to conservative Christians. The specific thing that the mainstream theologians have always disliked about the Gospel of John is that in it, Jesus repeatedly says that he is divine. And this is a major obstacle to the mainstream theologians in their quest to reconstruct the minimum historical Jesus, the marginal Galilean apocalyptic street preacher. And so the strategy that they're going to pursue here, as outlined by this paper, is first of all to dispense with the old theory that the Gospel of John and the epistles of John come from a self-contained community, the so-called Johannine community. What's ironic is that the Johannine community was a concept that the liberal scholars of the previous generation had come up with in order to disassociate the Gospel of John from Jesus' immediate followers, but still hold open the possibility that some dedicated group somewhere was passing on traditions that could have conceivably come from one of Jesus' disciples. So in the paper, Hugo Mendez attacks the idea of a Johannine community. He says, quote, "I find it telling that we've never found a trace of anything like a Johannine Christianity, no mentions in other ancient writings, and no archaeological traces. I think there's a reason for that. I think the community never existed." End quote. He's certainly not the first person who ever thought that, and those who have thought that used to have a somewhat harder time gaining a hearing, but the times have changed. The battle lines of the forever war are being constantly redrawn. And now, his colleagues like Bart Ehrman, who himself believed that there was such a thing as Johannine Christianity, at least up until fairly recently, now they're going to be much more receptive to a statement like that, especially since the word community, as used to describe any of the various groups of early Christians, has now fallen way out of favor among mainstream theologians. Community is like a curse word now among them. And because of the ever-changing demands of the forever war, they are now much more willing to countenance the idea that the Gospel of John is a forgery. For now, they'll qualify that and insist that they don't mean that it's a forgery in the sense that everything in it is completely made up. They just mean that the book is a pseudepigraphon. But by going as far as they have signaled their intent to take a much more adversarial stance against the Gospel of John, and there's something I really want to emphasize here in saying that. Throughout this mini-series, I've been arguing that the author of John knew Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and saying that the mainstream consensus is that the author of John didn't know those books, and that I suspect that to be the consensus for the sole reason that the mainstream scholars really want to preserve the Gospel of John as an independent source for Jesus. So how can that be reconciled with what I just talked about here, where the same scholars are now enthusiastically promoting someone who's calling John a forgery? The thing is, I don't think that they've reconciled that contradiction in their minds yet. For example, Bart Ehrman, when he initially promoted Hugo Mendez' paper, he said that there was only one thing in it that he disagreed with, which is that he doesn't think the author of John was deliberately trying to deceive the readers of his gospel. But if you're familiar with some of Bart Ehrman's opinions about the Gospel of John that he's written in his books, and you read this paper by Hugo Mendez with those opinions in mind, you find conflict after conflict after conflict. So I don't see how there could be only one thing in it that he disagrees with. In fact, he interviewed Hugo Mendez on his podcast, which he said was a very special episode since he himself was doing the interview instead of being interviewed. And he was very enthusiastic up until they got into the weeds and they started talking about the Gospel of John's reception history. And I guess Bart Ehrman, he heard enough statements that he disagreed with, and he briefly let the mask drop, and he temporarily forgot that he was supposed to be, supporting his fellow soldier here.
Not in the pieces of Papias that survive.
Right, but so I'm asking, when is the first name John? And Papias may have called it John. He may have called it Fred. I don't know. Right? I mean, is there a reason to think he named it John?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a clear reason to think that Papias, named it John. I'm wondering, are we getting sidetracked here? Just
a bit.
But this little moment was an anomaly. They can disagree on some stupid thing about Papias. Ultimately, this whole interview was an endorsement of the theory that Hugo Mendez came to discuss, and ultimately these two are on the same side in the Forever War. The Forever War is the driving force of New Testament studies, whether the individual scholars are aware that they're participating in it or not. And opinions will change, paradigms will change and shift over time based on the changing and shifting battlefronts in the war. And we recognize the imperative need for such a development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of criticism, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military theological complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced scholarship exists and will persist. You're listening to Born in the Second Century, and it's now 5:40 p.m. on December 22nd, 2023. The many letters are turning you to madness. This is episode 35 of the noted program on Christian origins, hosted by Chris Palmero. The music for today's broadcast was provided by the recording group Pompey Gray. We continue our Gospel of John mini-series, which will be concluded in the next show. And our goal is to demonstrate that John's Gospel is a derivative work and that its author was aware of and used the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Today, we'll continue our progress through the book, and we'll complete our coverage of the ministry of Jesus, which means that next time, the only thing left to cover will be the final few days of Jesus' life. Before we begin, I must add some additional items to the list of sources that I consulted for this mini-series. The Gospel According to John, a literary and theological commentary by Thomas Brodie. That one is from 1993. And The Critique of the Gospel of John by Bruno Bauer from 1840. The translation or the rendition by Neil Godfrey from vridar.org. Retweets are not endorsements. And I remind you of the question that I've been asking you to consider in this mini-series, which is whether anyone would have ever considered the Gospel of John to be independent of the other Gospels if the attestation for the historical Jesus was actually adequate, to the point where the biblical scholars didn't need to draft the Gospel of John as a unique and sorely needed witness to Jesus' life, ministry, and death. Back after this. Last time we left off right after the feeding of the 5,000, which was followed by the crowd chasing after Jesus to try to make him king, and the disciples departing over the sea or the lake in a boat. And later that night, Jesus walked on the water and joined the disciples in the boat. In the Gospel of Mark, which was John's primary source for this material, Jesus had simply dismissed the crowd after the feeding, whereas John has the crowd chase after him in a kind of a Life of Brian sequence. But John can't afford to get rid of the crowd entirely, because he needs them as an audience for the theological discourse that Jesus is about to give. So he has to come up with an artificial way to get Jesus back in front of them. And it's obvious that if John was independent and following his own traditions, then he wouldn't be subject to any of these constraints, right? He could have just set the scene whatever way he wanted. Now you might ask, if John needs to have Jesus deliver a speech at this point, why does that speech have to be in front of this same specific crowd? Jesus has already crossed the lake and gone to Capernaum. Why can't he just deliver the speech to a local audience there? And the answer is that the speech is going to turn on the concept of the audience not grasping the deeper significance of Jesus' feeding miracle. So it has to be spoken to the same audience that witnessed the miracle. He couldn't have had the speech happen right after that miracle because he was following Mark, where the walking on water is what happened after that miracle. But let's turn to John to find out what happened after the walking on water. Quote, "The next day, the crowd that stood on the other side of the sea saw that there was no other small boat there except one, and that Jesus hadn't entered with his disciples into the boat, but his disciples had gone away alone." End quote. The great scholar Rudolf Bultmann recognized that the purpose of the crowd seeing that one small boat remaining on the shore is to authenticate the walking on water miracle. And I'm emphasizing this because, to me, it's a clear sign that John was following Mark. Because in Mark, or actually any gospel, Jesus and the disciples usually go around in only one boat. They don't have like a flotilla or something. But here in John, the crowd sees one small boat by itself, and they infer from that both the disciples and Jesus have already crossed the lake, but they did so at separate times, and Jesus didn't use a boat to cross the lake because the boat that he would have used is still sitting right there on the beach. So John has basically invented a second boat strictly as a way to let us know that Jesus' miracle was independently verified. Now, if that was his goal, and he wasn't relying on the other Gospels, then he could have established more than one boat from the beginning. But this is in fact another instance of John being familiar with an extant miracle story and supplementing it with the literary device of third-party authentication. It's just like what we talked about last time in the opening reading with the healing of the royal official's son, where John added some extra third-party witnesses to the story. And so this thing with the boat, it's another sign that John was derivative. But some additional boats now conveniently show up, and they evacuate the crowd in like a Dunkirk scenario, and they bring them across the lake to Capernaum, where they encounter Jesus. And this is what John wanted, as we said. He had to get Jesus back in front of this audience. And now we can talk about the unholy speech that he has Jesus give. The setup is that the audience wants to know what work or what sign he's going to perform so that they can see it and believe in him. And we'll just note in passing that that line is uncannily similar to the one from Mark where they ask Jesus to perform a sign. But then they do refer to the feeding of the 5,000, which was the feeding of them, basically. But they seem to want something more than that. Moses already did something like that when he gave our ancestors the manna from heaven. What else you got? Technically, God gave them the manna. Moses was just the administrator of the manna. He just imposed Chicago school economics on the manna to limit the supply. But this is all in aid of setting up the theme of Jesus' monologue, which is that the manna wasn't the true bread from heaven. Jesus is the true bread from heaven. Now, the first thing to note here is that when Jesus starts talking about the true bread, the audience takes him literally at first. It's one of John's lost in translation moments. They ask him to give them the bread from heaven, and then he explains that he is the bread from heaven. And the biblical scholar Raymond Brown, even though he didn't believe that John knew the synoptic gospels, he compared this misunderstanding to a similar misunderstanding about bread in Mark and Matthew, where the disciples didn't understand Jesus' symbolism when he was talking about the loaves. And of course, that incident took place right after a miraculous feeding as well. The second thing to note here is that John deliberately positioned this speech after the feeding miracle in order to allegorize that miracle, to render it symbolic. The people ate bread that was provided by the Father through Jesus, who is the true bread. And by placing this symbolic speech right after the feeding of the 5,000, the author of John is making like a post hoc statement about something from the Gospel of Mark. Because in the last episode, we talked about John's treatment of miracles as opposed to the synoptic treatment, and how John was largely commenting on and correcting the view of miracles that the other Gospels had. And putting this bread speech here in this spot is another example of that. It forces us to think differently, right? To think symbolically about what seems at first glance to just be a straightforward nature miracle. But Jesus continues his monologue about being the bread of life, and this is when the Gospel of John briefly turns into a horror movie, where we get the dreadful suspense of Jesus darkly hinting at something unspeakable, and it builds until he finally reveals the terrifying truth, which is that we are to eat his flesh and drink his blood. In the last episode, I talked about the ecclesiastical redactor, which is a theorized final editor of the Gospel of John, who brought the Gospel more in line with early Catholic doctrine, where it had supposedly been much more Gnostic before that final edit. And I said that I don't believe in this theory of the ecclesiastical redactor, and I view it as an attempt to try to preserve John's independence by taking anything from the book that reflects obvious knowledge of Mark, Matthew, and Luke and assigning it to a later editor who naturally would have known those books. And Jesus' monologue about eating his flesh and drinking his blood has always been a perennial favorite for some theologians to assign to the redactor. They say that the passage contains foreign concepts, like most notably the ritual cannibalism, but also the fact that Jesus says that anyone who eats the Son of Man's flesh and drinks his blood will be raised up on the last day. And they argue that that statement conflicts with the realized eschatology that we find elsewhere in the Gospel of John, where salvation is a state that can be attained in the present time and comes through knowing and believing in Jesus. And they say that the redactor added this horrifying speech to John so that John would be more acceptable to the mainstream church, which celebrated the ritual cannibalism rite, as well as believing in the end-of-time eschatology with like the particular judgment and physical resurrection after death. But I said last time that in my view, the author of John was already a member of the mainstream church, even though he had heterodox beliefs. And specifically, when it came to certain doctrines that he was supposed to believe, like the physical sharing of the body and blood of Jesus being necessary for salvation, he chose to accept that more so on the symbolic level than the literal. And that's why I have no problem seeing John as the original author of this flesh-eating speech. As an early mainstream Christian, he'll go ahead and have Jesus talk about the sacrament of the Eucharist, but number one, he'll have him do it in the most cryptic way possible, and number two, he won't have him do it during an actual meal, like the Last Supper, and he won't have him handing out bread and saying, "This is my body, and this is my blood here in this cup." I would say that John was one of those early Christians who, when they served the bread and wine and they said that it was the body and blood of Jesus, was like, okay, they're just saying that for the dummies in the audience. The real eating and drinking that we're supposed to do is spiritual. This whole thing is just a metaphor. John is taking the words of institution from the Last Supper, from the Synoptics, and rewriting and recasting them in a way that's, first of all, more palatable to him and his intended audience, but also in a way that does not strictly conflict with the early Catholic concept of literally eating Jesus' body and drinking his blood in the form of bread and wine. This passage can be taken that way, just as it can also be taken in a fully spiritual way. And the passage absolutely is a rewrite of the Last Supper. I think it's highly unlikely that the author of John came up with the allegory of Jesus being the bread of life in an environment where no one knew about Jesus breaking the bread at the Last Supper. And he also just happened to put that bread of life speech right after the miraculous feeding of bread to the 5,000, which is a story that itself has parallels to the Last Supper. I also don't think it's a coincidence that this whole monologue took place on the day after John had said that the Passover was near, just as Luke, prior to the Last Supper, had said that the Passover was drawing near. And in fact, when Jesus tells the audience that the bread that he'll give for the life of the world is his flesh, it's an echo of the passage from Luke where he says, "This is my body, which is given for you." And there's something else that suggests that John is adapting the other Gospels here, and this comes from an observation by Thomas Brodie. Imagine if you had no other source about Jesus than the Gospel of John. When Jesus starts talking about how you have to eat his flesh and drink his blood, would you have any idea what the hell he was talking about? I mean, you would have had to have read the Synoptic Gospels, because it's not like Jesus explains himself. He doesn't say, "Eat my body and blood in the ritual meal." It sounds like he's speaking entirely literally. I mean, we could reasonably imagine him telling them to eat his flesh, and then, one of the true believers who's sitting in the front row gets up right after he says that, and he looks around and shrugs, and then he just comes up and bites Jesus on the arm. And then Jesus is like, "What the hell are you doing, Thomas? Like, what the hell's wrong with you?" But he brought it on himself. But this section in John is really a commentary or a midrash on something from the Synoptics, and we can see how close the parallels really are. And so hopefully you can also see why some scholars are very keen to attribute this passage to a later editor. But like I said last time, instead of coming up with this madcap speech, the editor could have just copy-pasted the actual Last Supper narrative from any of the other Gospels and put it into its rightful place on the night Jesus was arrested. And actually, see 1 Corinthians 11 for an example of an early Catholic editor who did that very thing. Before moving on, since we've been talking about the Last Supper, I wanted to stick with that topic for a bit. Here in John, instead of the usual narrative that we get at that point, we get another long Jesus speech, the farewell discourse. I don't think we'll spend too much time on the farewell discourse in the next show, so I wanted to bring one of its elements up here, because it's relevant to what we were just talking about, and that is the foot washing sequence. John has this thing where, on the night of his arrest, Jesus washes the feet of the disciples. And after that, he says, "If I, the Lord and teacher, washed your feet, you also should wash each other's feet." Which they might as well have had him say that into the camera. Like, got that, fellow Christians? This is going to be our new thing from now on. But that's why I bring this up. I mean, this thing with the foot washing is actually one of the very few places in the New Testament where we get that very rare sense of proximity to a real human being from the ancient past. It's like something from the Cave of Forgotten Dreams documentary. Because it is very obvious, as St. Gordon Rylance pointed out, that John here has tried to come up with some kind of ritual that was meant to replace both baptism and the Eucharist. We know that it replaces baptism because when Peter wants Jesus to wash his hands and head as well, Jesus says there's no need. Anyone who has bathed needs only to wash his feet and is completely clean, he says to Peter. And then he turns to the camera and says, "That's why baptism is really kind of stupid when you think about it, isn't it, fellow Christians?" And it replaces the Eucharist because it effectively replaces the words of institution over the bread and wine. And it's not for nothing, by the way, that the author says that Jesus began the foot washing after dinner. Now, the next time that you are in prison or stranded in a becalmed container ship or whatever environment you're in where reading the Gospel of John is like the most sensible activity that you could do at that moment, I recommend that you look closely at chapter 13 and look for where it says, Jesus gets up from dinner, sets his garments aside, and girds himself with a towel. Reflect on that sentence and how the author is letting us know that Jesus could not be more finished eating at that point. Then scroll down about half a page and marvel at the fact that Jesus and the disciples are somehow now said to be eating bread and dipping morsels into a bowl. It means that John, when he first wrote this section, he started with a Last Supper motif that he would have inherited from the other Gospels. But he later went back and he superimposed his foot washing ritual over the top of that. And that's why I said that part about the ritual gives us a sense of proximity to John, because the foot washing is very obviously a hastily contrived idea of like an ad hoc replacement for baptism in the Eucharist. It seems like it was the best of a long list of other, even more mediocre ideas for a replacement. And so this is a passage where we see the author trying his best to be clever and show some ingenuity, but failing. And it's really easy to envision the author racking his brain here, like, I hate the crass physicality of the baptism and the Eucharist, but these morons want there to be some physical ritual that they can do in church. Okay, what kind of ritual can I come up with instead where the symbolism is already baked in? See, because to him, baptism is not great because he doesn't like the idea of purifying water. He knows about living water, which is a spiritual conception. You shouldn't think that you could be saved by dipping yourself into a pond like Bill Murray in Caddyshack. And he doesn't like the Eucharist because you can't be saved by eating a piece of bread. God gave the Israelites magic bread from heaven, and every single one of them died. So he comes up with this concept of foot washing here, where the symbolism is so bland and almost workmanlike, actually. And the concept itself was actually inspired by two different passages in the Gospel of Luke. The first one being the scene with the woman who's a repentant sinner, and the other one being the line where Jesus says, "I am among you as one who serves." And the saddest thing is, this was all a completely wasted effort on the part of John, since many Christian churches just ended up doing all three rituals, the baptism, the Eucharist, and the foot washing. But before we go to the next sequence, as an added bonus, I just want to bring up something that Jesus says to Peter here. He tells him, "If I don't wash you, you have no part with me." And it was Peter who told Simon Magus in the book of Acts that you have no part or lot in this matter, because Simon had tried to purchase the charismatic gifts with money. I am agnostic on whether John knew Acts of the Apostles, but I have reported this possible parallel so that you can decide for yourselves. But all of what we've discussed about the body and blood of Jesus and the eating and drinking him, it demonstrates John's awareness of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. He has taken the words of institution and overlaid his conception of Jesus as the Logos over the top of them, and he has recast them into a Gnostic riddle. But now we can turn to some other signs of John's awareness of the other Gospels that show up around here, and these are three of what I'll call incidental comments. The first two are said by the audience, which the author is now suddenly referring to as the Jews, which he had not done up to this point. When Jesus calls himself the bread of life, they don't like that, and they say, "Isn't that Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How is he now saying, 'I've come down out of heaven'?" And we'll call this the lineage comment, since it speaks to Jesus' family background. In the next chapter, Jesus gets in trouble with another crowd, and the crowd there says something that's similar to the lineage comment. They say, "How has this man become learned, having never been educated?" And we'll call that the education comment. And lastly, there's a throwaway line that the narrator says right after Jesus' cannibalism speech, quote, "These things he said in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum," end quote. And we'll call that the Capernaum comment. And we're going to examine all three of these. But first, I want to establish that these comments are an indication that John composed these long speeches where the comments occur ahead of time, and he slotted them into what he felt were suitable locations in his gospel. What he did with the speeches was to take short phrases from the controversies in the synoptics and use them as occasional scenery, and these are the incidental comments that we just went over. And we're now going to demonstrate that the incidental comments reveal that John was aware of at least the Gospel of Luke, along with at least one of the other two synoptic Gospels, and possibly both. And the first one, again, is the lineage comment, where the crowd says, "Isn't that Joseph's son?" The second one is the education comment, "How did this man become learned?" The third one is the Capernaum comment, "He said these things while teaching in the synagogue at Capernaum." In Mark and Matthew, the education comment and the lineage comment are fully fleshed out sentences, and one leads into the other. But neither of them mention Joseph. In fact, they fairly mention everyone except Joseph. Mark has the crowd say, "Isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary and the brother of James and Jason and Tommy and so on?" Matthew has much the same thing, except instead of carpenter, they say, "Isn't that the carpenter's son?" Neither Mark nor Matthew say that this exchange happened in Capernaum. They do say that it happened when Jesus was teaching in the synagogue, but they say that the synagogue was in, quote, "his own part of the country." And we've seen in previous shows that Mark seems to have thought of Capernaum as Jesus' hometown. And it's notable that Matthew, who's following Mark here, and whom we also know considers Nazareth to be Jesus' hometown, is nonetheless reluctant to update Mark's language here. He leaves Mark's ambiguous statement about the location his own part of the country. He doesn't change it to Nazareth. Now, when we turn to Luke, we find that the lineage comment and the education comment are not fully fleshed out unique sentences as they were in Mark and Matthew. Instead, they are elided and combined. And also, unlike Mark and Matthew, in Luke, the crowd actually does say, "Isn't that Joseph's son?" as John has them say. In Luke, the scene takes place while Jesus is teaching in a synagogue, but the synagogue is neither in Capernaum nor in Jesus' own part of the country, whatever that means, but Luke explicitly says that it is in Nazareth. In fact, this scene in Luke is where the audience says the famous line about, "Do here in your hometown whatever was done at Capernaum." In episode 21 on the Gospel of Luke, I said that this synagogue sequence, even though it doesn't closely follow Mark, was nonetheless based on Mark. Because this sequence was the new intro for Jesus' ministry that the author of Luke came up with when he combined Mark with his pre-existing sources. And what John has done here is to borrow incidental elements from all of the synoptic gospels to construct this background scenery for his long discourses. He has a standalone lineage comment and a standalone education comment like Mark and Matthew have. For the lineage comment, he follows Luke, though, and specifically zeroing in on Joseph and naming him to the exclusion of everyone else. As we alluded to at the beginning of this series, John has some special interest in not ever naming Jesus' mother, but he has less of a problem with naming Jesus' father, that is his earthly father. And this is his second mention of Joseph in this book. Now, when it comes to the Capernaum comment, these things took place in Capernaum when he was teaching in the synagogue. I think that here, John decided to follow Mark, who effectively implied that the synagogue teaching happened in Capernaum. Because Mark says that it took place in Jesus' hometown, and he implies elsewhere that Capernaum is Jesus' hometown. And I think an additional proof that John followed Mark here is that even though John has already said at this point that Jesus is from Nazareth, here he's depicting the crowd in Capernaum as being familiar with Jesus' father Joseph for some reason. And so therefore John, whether he realized it or not, is now effectively agreeing with Mark that Jesus is from Capernaum, since Nazareth was like 45 miles away, and so it's unlikely that this crowd in the synagogue would have known Jesus' family. But these were the incidental comments, and hopefully they have helped demonstrate that the Gospel of John is derivative. But moving on. The immediate result of Jesus' insane flesh-eating speech is that his followers are upset. After he said that it's necessary to eat him in order to live, we are told that many of them grumbled about it. Talk about someone who's unable to eat bread. Jesus' followers are not only unable, but unwilling to eat bread in this case. And they say, that's a difficult statement, which is a line that Dante alluded to in the Divine Comedy at the gates of hell, where it says, abandon all hope, you who enter. And he said that the meaning of those words was difficult for him. These followers who take exception to Jesus here are indicated as not being part of the 12. The 12 actually reinforce their loyalty to Jesus here. Jesus asked them if they're going to leave him as well, and Simon Peter says, Lord, to whom would we go? You have words of eternal life. We have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God. This is a subversion of a scene from the other Gospels, which is Peter's confession at the town of Caesarea Philippi. I alluded to this incident in the first episode of the series. In the other Gospels, Jesus asked the disciples, who do you say that I am? Or who do you believe me to be, basically? And Peter responds with some variation of, you are the Christ, depending on what Gospel you're looking at. And I said that John hates that story, just like he hates Jesus' prayer of agony before the arrest, and so he's going to subvert it. And the main reason that John doesn't like the story of Peter's confession is because it insinuates that the 12 disciples have special insight that in John's mind they weren't actually entitled to at this point. And in this, John actually shares the philosophy of the or text, which is the theoretical source that we talked about in our shows about the resurrection appearances. And in the view of that text, the disciples received their special insight only after Jesus rose from the dead and instructed them. Of the other three Gospels, Luke is the one that's closest to that philosophy, but Luke also decided to follow Mark very closely, whereas John has shown himself to be a bit more freewheeling, so we're now going to see how he dispenses with this legend that he doesn't like. First of all, it's worth looking at how each of the other three Gospels phrase Peter's confession. Jesus asked the disciples, who do you say that I am? And in Mark, Peter says, you are the Christ. That's it. And Jesus warns them to tell no one. Luke presents the same setup as Mark, but he has Peter say, you are the Christ of God. But it is when we turn to Matthew that we encounter something with rather surprising implications for our series here. In response to the question, who do you say that I am? Matthew tells us that Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. First of all, this is the one place in the entirety of Matthew's gospel where Peter is called Simon Peter. But Jesus responds by saying, blessed are you, Simon Bar Jonah, or Simon son of Jonah, because flesh and blood didn't reveal that to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I want to quickly talk about this Simon son of Jonah thing. This line here in Matthew is the only place in the synoptics where the name of Peter's father is indicated. Now, early in the Gospel of John, Jesus refers to Peter as Simon, son of John. But there are some manuscripts that have him say Simon, son of Jonah, and Jonah and John are not variants of the same name. Also, at the end of John's Gospel, Jesus asks Peter the threefold question about whether he loves him, and he calls him Simon, son of John, all 3 times. The same manuscripts that have him saying Simon, son of Jonah at the beginning also have him saying it down there. Now, turning to Matthew, where he says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah." There's a theoretical lost book that's usually called the Gospel of the Nazarenes, and it's preserved mainly through marginal notes that were made on certain manuscripts of Matthew, where the copyists knew the Gospel of the Nazarenes, and so whenever they noticed a difference between that book and Matthew, they noted it down in the margin. And for this line here, where he says, Simon, son of Jonah, the copyist wrote down, the Jewish version has Simon, son of John. And I have said all this to you to prove a very important point, which is that I examined a critical apparatus when I prepared this episode. But what these text variants indicate to me was that it was not a matter of life and death, at least among some Christians, to alter the name of Peter's father. And I've delved into this here because throughout this mini-series, although I've been repeatedly saying that John knew the synoptics or used the synoptics, most of the examples have come from Mark and a few have come from Luke. Not many examples have come from Matthew, but there are some occasional instances like this one where John does appear to show some awareness of Matthew as well, but for whatever reason, he didn't use it as much as the others. I think that John's access to Matthew was limited, like perhaps in the environment where he was writing, there was only one good copy of Matthew, and maybe it was always being used by someone else, or maybe some authority figure didn't want John to use it that much, so he only shows occasional flashes of it. And looking at this confession story, I think that John borrowed the patronymic that Matthew had used for Peter. And remember how I said in episode 33 that John seemed in that section like he was just piling on every single alternate name for this character that he could find. And so he pulled in the name of Simon, son of Jonah from Matthew, and he changed Jonah to the similar sounding John. And that was either a copying error or it could have been an attempt to give Peter's father a more generic and thus a much safer name, since the name John was like 4 times more popular than the name Jonah in the 2nd century. I mean, even the author of this book was named John. Am I right, fundamentalist? But back to the main thread here. Going back to the story itself, we know that in this sequence, John is subverting the tale of Peter's confession from the other Gospels. And he actually does that several times in this book, with this one here being the most explicit, probably. And also in episode 33, I alluded to Peter's statement here, we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God. And another way we can tell that this is a reference to the original Peter's confession story is that Peter didn't actually have to say all that. Jesus had said, you don't want to go away too, do you? And Peter initially came back with, no, why would we? You have words of eternal life. But then he goes on to add this very ponderous statement of faith. And in fact, it's not even clear if Jesus even registered what he said. But John had to have Peter issue this awkward, unconnected statement of faith here with no lead-up because he certainly wasn't about to have Jesus ask him, who do you say that I am, like he did in the other books, because that would imply that Jesus didn't already know the answer to that question. And another important thing, which we've also touched on, is Peter's bizarre wording here. He says, we believe that you are the Holy One of God, which the Holy One of God was what the demons had called Jesus in the other Gospels. And so, as I said back then, John is giving the 12 only as much credit as is necessary. He's certainly not going to award Peter any God-given insight here, as Matthew did. Peter and the rest of the 12 accept that Jesus is from heaven and that he's been sent by God, and so for now, they get to have the same level of understanding that the demons have. John hates the confession story so much that he's already subverted it 3 times before this point. At the beginning, when Jesus reveals that he was aware of Nathanael before meeting him, Nathanael is just blown away. And he says, Rabbi, you're the Son of God. You're the King of Israel. So he loads him up with even more titles than Peter did in the confession story from the other Gospels. Yet what does Jesus say? You believe that because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? You'll see even greater things. It could be argued that part of the famous Nicodemus dialogue is a parody of Peter's confession. Nicodemus, like Nathanael, recognized the signs that Jesus was doing and acknowledged him as a teacher who had come from God, and yet he didn't grasp the meaning of the theological point that Jesus went on to make. The Samaritan woman tells Jesus that she knows that he's a prophet, yet she doesn't grasp his point about the living water or what he says about the so-called correct place of worship. And then we get this incident with Peter, and Jesus then rebukes Peter, because that's what the other Gospels have him doing in this confession story, and we'll revisit that a bit later. There's going to be another parody of the confession statement in the Lazarus story, the Raising of Lazarus, which we'll get much more into later on as well. But as far as the confession part, Lazarus is the deceased friend of Jesus, and he has two sisters, Mary and Martha. When Jesus arrives on the scene, he speaks with Martha, and he tells her that her brother will rise again. And she says, "I know he will. He'll rise at the resurrection." And Jesus says, "No, Martha, I am the resurrection." And then he asks her if she believes that, and just like Peter and his word salad about the Holy One of God, Martha answers this relatively straightforward question with a creedal statement. Because all Jesus had said was, "Anyone who believes in me will never die. Do you believe that?" When a God asks you if you believe whatever they just said, you say yes. And she does at first, but then she adds a lot of unnecessary extra material that sounds like she's qualifying her answer. "I have believed that you are the Christ, God's Son, the one who comes into the world." It's like, does she think she's being deposed here? And she doesn't want to incriminate herself, so she's just being extremely precise with her answer? But in reality, and as many have pointed out, John has given Martha a line of dialogue that's very reminiscent of Peter's confession from Matthew. And just like the other parodies of the confession that we looked at, the fact that she maybe said the right thing there doesn't end up mattering, because Jesus goes to her brother's tomb and she voices doubt that he can actually accomplish anything. And so all this demonstrates that John was aware of the story of Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi, and he was subverting it because for John, the fundamental truth about Jesus is mystical knowledge that Jesus has to reveal. And what he reveals is that he is the only way to eternal life. And that can't be recognized by witnessing silly parlor tricks, like the fact that he knows what you were doing under the fig tree, or that he knows about your marital history, and it can't even be recognized by witnessing the dramatic signs that he performs. If you have faith, witnessing those things might bring you closer to the true knowledge than many others, but you can't fully access the knowledge until the predetermined time. And so John doesn't like the story of Peter's confession, which implies that Peter didn't need to get the secret revelation directly from Jesus. Now, what if, for the sake of argument, we accept that John was aware of Peter's confession, the historical incident, as opposed to Peter's confession, the synoptic gospel story? In other words, something like the confession happened in real life, and John learned about it through independent tradition. If that were the case, we would have to ask what that tradition looked like that John just felt that he could subvert it so dramatically. Because if the tradition really existed, then John's variant of the tradition just happened to be the one that removed all significance from the original incident. And that's really the main difficulty with the conventional view of John's gospel, that John didn't know the other gospels. Because if you account for the similarities based on John having similar but alternative traditions, then you would have to explain how it happens so many times that John's alternative traditions are like the precise diametrical opposite of the synoptic traditions. I think it's much more plausible that John is taking the synoptic version of these scenes and spinning it, because he knows that the scenes raise issues that he has to address. If he truly was following independent traditions, he could have avoided these problems entirely by just never referencing these scenes. He didn't have to reference Peter's confession, but he did because he was aware of the other Gospels and of the threat that that story posed to his overall presentation. There's something else in this general scene that I wanted to highlight. It has to do with the many disciples that stopped following Jesus once he told everyone to eat his flesh. All four Gospels indicate in some way that Jesus had dedicated followers beyond the initial 12, but it is Luke and John who place the most emphasis on that fact. And hopefully by now there's a pattern forming, which is that the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John may come from the same setting. But John says here that many disciples stop following Jesus, and the 12 are the only ones who stick around. But I actually think that this is a way for John to undermine the importance of the 12. As I said at the beginning of the series, he doesn't set up a coherent narrative about their calling, and he never lists their names in full. In fact, I honestly think that John, if he had it his way and really was independent, would have dispensed with the 12 entirely. And the fact that he kept them in has nothing to do with the fact that Jesus had a historical 12 disciples, because everyone should recognize that the 12 are unhistorical, everyone. Even if you don't agree with most of what I say, you should acknowledge that it's very unlikely that Jesus had a core following of 12 guys, and that shouldn't even be a controversial statement. There's the significance of the number 12 in the Jewish Bible. You got the early sources not being aware that one of the 12 betrayed Jesus, and hence he instructs 12 disciples when he comes back from the dead. Or during his ministry, he talks about setting them up on 12 thrones. You got the fact that 7 of the 12 are nothing more than names. You got the discrepancies with sources like Celsus, where he says that Jesus rounded up 10 or 11 or 12 or 13 cutthroats and sailors. Or the letter of Barnabas, where it says that he gathered the world's biggest sinners to be his followers. You got the fact that the sources can't always agree on the names of the lesser disciples. You got the anachronistic title of zealot being applied to one of them. So the thing about the 12 is not real. The concept of Jesus having 12 disciples was imposed as a requirement by some author at some point, whether it fit into the existing material or not. And so it means that John is not maintaining the fiction of the 12 because that's what historical tradition requires, and woe to any author who ignores that. He's maintaining the fiction because the 12 are part of the generally accepted Christian myth at this point. And the sources that he's following to learn that from, the other Gospels are also maintaining that fiction for the same reason. John can't afford to dispense with it. And this should also serve as a critique of the criterion of multiple attestation, where the biblical scholars claim that because an event in the life of Jesus is replicated in more than one source, it therefore has a better chance of being historically accurate, since the author would have been unable to ignore it because it was a real historical thing. But that's not the only reason why an author would reproduce a fact that's also stated in another source. It could just be that the universe of the story that he's writing wouldn't make sense if he didn't include it. Like, I remember when George Lucas sold Star Wars to Disney, and he was saying that he wanted to stay on as a consultant, at least briefly, to get Disney acclimated to the Star Wars universe. And he was supposedly going to explain to them what can and can't happen in that universe. And the one example he gave was, the cars fly above the ground. They don't have wheels. That's an example of what I would be teaching them about. And it's like, if I were Disney, I would have just said, you could write that stuff in an email if you want. Just send it to us. We don't need to do a whole big meeting or anything. But my point is that anyone who inherits this universe is going to try to follow its fundamental rules so that the story makes sense and follows the basic template. But if they don't like some of the rules, they can subvert them while still following them in some way. They follow the letter and not the spirit. And I think that's a very apt description of John's approach. John is countering the understanding of the disciples that came from the kingdom preaching movement that ascribed outsized importance to them. It's from them that the concept of the 12 originally came from. They're the ones who came up with that quote about the 12 thrones, for example. And John recognized that Mark had already tried to cut the 12 down to size, but he didn't go far enough. John wants to subordinate them and keep them in an auxiliary role, and then merely imply that they became authority figures only after the resurrection. And to further cut them down to size during Jesus' lifetime, he first of all introduces the beloved disciple, which we already know that scholars like David Litwa and Hugo Mendez have correctly said that the beloved disciple is an authenticating witness for the gospel as a whole that the author invented. But the beloved disciple serves another purpose, which is to take the focus off of Peter and the more famous disciples that the Christian audience would have been familiar with. At this point in the gospel that we're now looking at, the beloved disciple hasn't been mentioned yet. And what I think is that John had not yet come up with the idea for this character at this point in the story. It seems the direction he was originally going in was to just downplay the 12 and kind of make them all interchangeable. And that was the point that I was leading to, where the 12 are really just the remainder of many disciples, and a lot of whom absconded after the flesh-eating speech. But then at some point after that, John came up with the idea to have kind of a mole within the 12, who would be the one who preserved the real information about Jesus, which is contained in the book that you're reading. It seems like the kind of idea that an author would come up with when they were not specifically at the writing table. I'm sure that John came up with the concept of the beloved disciple when he was taking a Hellenistic shower or something. But all that we've talked about here speaks to John being a derivative work, because the author has inherited this monolithic institution of the 12 that he's now saddled with, and he somehow has to push them into the background, and he ultimately comes up with several different means of doing that. And again, considering that the institution of the 12 was not historical, we can assume that John wrote about the 12 in the way that he did because he was countering or subverting the narrative about them that he found in the synoptics. And he created so much chaos in doing so that a real redactor, not the fake ecclesiastical redactor, had to come in at some point and add the final chapter of John and rehabilitate Peter and dispense with the beloved disciple. And I recognize that we are in the midst of a fairly weedy digression at this point, but I'm now going to take us even further into the weeds because I actually want to bring up something that happens in that final chapter of John. After Jesus has his pep talk with Peter at the end of the book, and he ends it by saying, "Follow me," Peter then points to the beloved disciple and says, "What about this man?" Jesus says, "If I want him to stay until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." And then it says, "Therefore that saying went out among the brothers that disciple wouldn't die. Yet Jesus didn't say to him that he wouldn't die, but if I want him to stay until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple who's testifying to these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And there are also many other things that Jesus did, which, if they're written in detail, I suppose even the world itself can't contain the books that would be written." End quote. Notice something that hardly ever gets pointed out, which is that Jesus did not circle back and answer Peter's question, which was, what's going to happen with this guy? Because Jesus' conversation with Peter, the pep talk, was obviously an anachronistic metaphor about church order and Peter being the primal authority in the ancient church. It's similar to the confession scene from Matthew, where he declares Peter to be the rock on which the church is built. And I'm not including that as an example of John being derivative because this final chapter I consider to be a secondary addition. But what Jesus essentially said to Peter in that pep talk was, "You will be the head of the church, and after that, you'll be imprisoned and martyred." Peter then pointed to the beloved disciple and said, well, where does he fit into that scheme? What's his role going to be? And then the redactor actually goes to a non sequitur. He deliberately confuses the audience by taking a Jesus quote that was in circulation among some Christians of the time, which was probably a quote that bothered him. Some Christians in the late 2nd century were claiming that there was a legendary disciple out there, probably in the desert somewhere, who wouldn't die until the second coming, kind of like a reverse wandering Jew. And the church didn't like this legend, and so the redactor took it upon himself to solve the problem here. Like, oh, it was just semantic confusion. Jesus didn't say that he would never die, but if he wanted to, he could make it to where he never died, but it's none of your business anyway. I suspect that when the Gospel of John was initially released, like before this chapter was added, some of its more enthusiastic readers might have latched onto this beloved disciple and conflated him with this legendary, immortal, early Christian. You know, that or the initial author of John handed in his work, and the church authorities anticipated that the beloved disciple would be associated with the immortal Christian, and so to prevent that, they brought in the redactor, who dispensed with both legends in one elegant motion. But as I was saying, Jesus never actually answered Peter's question. All he did was imply that the beloved disciple wouldn't be martyred. And then the narrator, who now speaks in the first person singular for the very first time, reveals himself to be the beloved disciple. So this whole sequence here in the final chapter, which has been the source of a lot of confusion and debate as to when the Gospel of John was written, because it seems to indicate a sense of surprise that this individual died when it was believed that he was never going to die. It's all just BS, sleight of hand, and it's being done to sideline this new character that the original author had created, and it worked, in fact. But let's now return to the main sequence. There are a few more things we can point out in this general section, including 2 instances of the author's famous DVD director's commentary technique. The first one happens when Jesus says to the crowd that some of them don't believe, and then the author hits pause and he chimes in with, "Ladies and gentlemen, Jesus knew from the beginning the ones who didn't believe and the ones who would hand him over." And then the Peter's confession happens and Jesus issues a rebuke like he does in the Synoptics, and I said we would come back to that. In the Synoptics, he calls Peter Satan. In John, he effectively says that one of the 12 is a devil. And then we get some DVD commentary on that. "Folks, he was talking about Judas of Simon Iscariot right there because Judas was one of the 12, and he was intending to betray Jesus because he was well, actually, I think we have some actual audio of this one.
A defiler, a betrayer, a backstabber, a devil!"
So we thank John for that insight. What he actually said was that Jesus was specifically singling out Judas as the devil, and he, as the narrator, tells us that Judas is the one who was going to betray Jesus. And he calls Judas one of the 12, and later on he'll effectively repeat that same line, and he'll refer to Judas there as one of the disciples. And this is an awkward habit that he picked up from the other Gospels. Mark and Matthew called Judas one of the 12 on 2 different occasions. Luke calls him that once. So if John was independent, then it's somewhat odd that he chose to speak about Judas in this way for no discernible reason when he doesn't do that for any of the other disciples. Another thing is that John follows the other Gospels in telegraphing Judas as the betrayer of Jesus this early on in the story. The other Gospels do that when they list the 12 disciples. Each of them round out their list with some variation of, and Judas, the one who betrayed him. So John looks like he's doing the same thing, except he adds an additional detail that pretty much requires us to accept that he was following at least one of the prior Gospels. He says that Judas was intending to betray Jesus. And that sounds like a similar portrayal to what Mark and Matthew have, where Judas betrays Jesus out of venal motives, but he does so fully on his own. But later in John, the author's characterization of Judas will shift, and it'll line up more with the Gospel of Luke, where Satan is ultimately responsible for the betrayal, and he possessed Judas and merely made him his instrument. But John won't even be able to get that straight. He contradicts himself even there. It's possible that in this earlier spot where he says that Judas intended to betray Jesus, John hadn't been exposed to the Gospel of Luke yet. But when he finally did become aware of Luke and he observed Luke's motif of Satan's possession of Judas, he said, oh shit, that's a much better idea than what I had, and he worked it in accordingly. Either way, with whatever characterization of Judas that we focus on, John gives us no actual information about Judas and his plot that can't be extrapolated from the Synoptic Gospels, and we get nothing that could plausibly be demonstrated to come from independent tradition. Added to which, there are some scholars who consider the very character of Judas in itself to be a product of Markan redaction, and that would explain, for example, the fact that so many sources have 12 disciples witnessing the resurrection like we just talked about. And lastly, we have to point out that this line of dialogue, where Jesus indicates that he specifically knows that it will be a disciple that betrays him, it looks like another attempt by John to clarify and correct the synoptics. The part where Jesus predicts his own death, but, he never specifies that a disciple will hand him over. In fact, in the Synoptics, Jesus doesn't reveal that he knows that until the Last Supper. And John wants us to be aware that Jesus wasn't blindsided by this betrayal. He was aware of it even at the time he called Judas, which, of course, happened off screen, since John had absolutely no knowledge about how that might have went down and what may have been said. Don't you think that if John had an independent tradition about Jesus' calling of Judas, that he could have crafted a really good scene for that with thought-provoking dialogue and foreshadowing, and maybe we could have learned what Iscariot means, and maybe John could have commented on the relationship between the name Judas and the word Jew, since he's always so interested in talking about Jews? No. This author is like a plagiarist YouTuber rewording a Wikipedia article for a so-called video essay. He had nothing unique to add to this discussion, except that Judas carried the money box and that his father had the 3rd most common name in the entire Middle East. But when we come back, we will enter the primordial chaos that is the middle section of the Gospel of John. Back after this. The level of entropy in the Gospel of John steadily rises as we get into the middle chapters. Anything from chapters 7 through 10 is an unmitigated chaos. We've talked before about the possibility of 1 or 2 chapters being out of order, but in this section, it's like someone took every single sentence and put them into like a blower machine from bingo and drew them back out one by one and put them back together in whatever order they came out in. It's bad enough to where anyone who claims that the Gospel of John is their favorite New Testament book, they should be required to explain how they feel about these middle chapters, because this part cannot be a fulfilling reading experience for anyone who's going through this as just a straightforward book. But the purpose of these chapters is that John is taking all of the long discourses that he has composed separately from the narrative, or that some, like Rudolf Bultmann, would say that he's pulling from a prior discourse source, and he's structuring them around set-piece vignettes. And so, for example, he's got a long speech that he has to have Jesus deliver, and so he sets up some kind of miracle story or other incident, and he structures the speech around it. And he encounters 2 major problems in using this literary technique. The first one is that the volume of the discourses far outweighs the volume of the action and the actual stories that he can tell. And so anything that happens at all in this section of the book ends up looking like an obvious excuse to have Jesus deliver a long speech. And that's because of general framework theory, which is a concept that I've been bringing up throughout this series, which is that the very structure of John's gospel presupposes the other gospels. The author's following a template. If the Gospel of John was totally independent of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, then how did the author magically come up with the idea to use the same format as Mark, Matthew, and Luke, where it's miracle stories punctuated by teaching or discourses against the ultimate backdrop of a progress from Galilee to Jerusalem? So general framework theory continues to be important for our analysis, and I do hope I get recognized for coming up with it and that I get to go on New Testament review. And I'm sure that if that happens, someone from Reddit or the Academic Bible subreddit might do a post about me and say, that unqualified guy from that podcast said that he was the first one to ever notice that John follows the structure of Mark, but in reality, scholars like Aloysius Agnew had already observed that phenomenon as early as 1753. And what I would say in response, first of all, downvote. But I would respond by saying that may very well be the case, but I was the first to name a theory after that concept. And that's the difference. See, that's what you got to do. You got to play the game. But we're talking about the chaos that is this middle section in John. And I think that when John put this middle section together, he had Luke's travel narrative in mind. And Luke's travel narrative occurs around this same point in the Gospel of Luke, where it's between the Galilean and Jerusalem stuff in the middle. And it's really just a series of backdrops against which Luke can project the various Q sayings and the other sayings material from the Proto-Luke. But the difference there is that in Luke, the sayings and the parables are relatively concise. To set up the parable of the Good Samaritan, for example, all you need to do is have Jesus addressing an audience and have someone ask him about the word neighbor, and then he can transition into the parable. And he doesn't even need to stick around after that. He talks for a minute and a half, go and do likewise, and then he moves on. But John has a different problem. He has to have Jesus deliver lengthy, sustained monologues that are also occasionally interrupted by angry spectators who are not angry enough to where they simply jump him and cut the monologue short. Another thing is that unlike the author of Luke, the author of John is not trying to blow through this material. The author of John wants us to hear every word of these speeches. So that's the first problem here that causes this chaos. There's not enough of a premise for these monologues. And the second major problem is that the monologues themselves are all very similar to each other, and they're very monotonous as well. And the author of John, this religious genius who has touched the hearts of so many and wrote such a spiritually fulfilling book that's been so rewarding to so many, he has an extremely limited range, and he tends to over-explain the simplest things through unnecessary repetition and a droning style, and what I would call an affected obscurity, in that it seems like someone who's trying to copy the style of the Hermetic writings, but isn't too familiar with them. So it's more of a slow and deliberate copying. But the one thing they have picked up from those writings that they do really well is to make it seem like the characters are always speaking in riddles. But then, because the author also feels the need to over-explain everything, he has Jesus painstakingly go back over everything he says. But his over-explanations are in the form of riddles as well. So it ends up sounding like this, quote, He said again to them, I go away, and you will seek me and will die in your sin. Where I'm going, you can't come. So the Jews were saying, surely he won't kill himself, will he? Since he says, where I'm going, you can't come. And he was saying to them, you are from below, I am from above. You are of this world, I am not of this world. Therefore I said to you that you'll die in your sins, because unless you believe that I am, then you'll die in your sins. So they were saying to him, who are you? Jesus said to them, what have I been saying to you from the beginning? I have many things to speak and judge about you, but the one who sent me is true, and the things that I heard from him, those I speak to the world. Ladies and gentlemen, they didn't realize that he'd been speaking to them about the Father just now. So this is a small part of what we're dealing with, and that's why I didn't want to get into theories about the original order or the correct order of the Gospel of John while we're doing this series, because it's very possible that the author wouldn't have known the correct order, especially in this section. I bring all this up as a mild warning that this book is going to be extremely chaotic, almost up until the moment where Jesus gets arrested. But we pick back up with Jesus at home in Galilee with his brothers. Real quick, there's something from the Percival Gardner Smith book that I wanted to address. He's the theologian from the mid-20th century who really started the trend of seeing John as independent of the other Gospels. In introducing this section, John says that Jesus was now walking in Galilee because he was unwilling to walk in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. We mentioned last time that some theologians take the Gospel of John as implying that Jesus was from Judea. The theologians who believe that are generally the ones who are really invested in John being independent. And Percival Gardner Smith literally wrote the book on John being independent, and he seizes on every opportunity to try to associate Jesus with Judea. And here, where it says that Jesus was unwilling to spend time there, he takes that as a further proof that that's where Jesus was from. Because to him, that line indicates that Judea was Jesus's proper sphere, and that his visits to Galilee were exceptional, and that this little notice by John depicts Galilee as a remote and unimportant district in which it was not proper for Jesus to remain. And he says that John's information about Jesus' whereabouts must rest upon information derived from oral tradition, which branched off from the mainstream at quite an early period, when stories had not yet been set in any general framework. And I get emails from critics of this show occasionally, and one of the consistent criticisms that I've always gotten is that I apparently read too much into certain things or certain passages. I overread is the phrase that I think one of them used. And if that's true, all I can say is that I learned from the best, or like they said in the commercial, I learned it from you. Because that quote from Percival Gardner Smith was a triumph of overanalysis of a text. I mean, obviously it would help his theory tremendously if John did not think that Jesus was from Galilee, because then you would have John disagreeing with the synoptics on a fundamental point. So he seized on the ambiguity of this statement here about Jesus' location and spun it into something that supported his thesis. And it's especially ridiculous when you consider that John, immediately after saying that Jesus was hiding out in Galilee, goes on to tell us that he was hanging out with his brothers. If Galilee is not his home, then why are his brothers there? And speaking of Jesus' brothers, they are our next topic of discussion. Now, John learned about Jesus' brothers from the Synoptic Gospels, and here's how we know that. He tells us nothing about them that we didn't learn from the other Gospels, and the little vignette into which he puts them here also comes from the other Gospels. In Mark, when Jesus is in his hometown, or his own part of the country, like we talked about earlier, Mark has him deliver the line about how a prophet is never respected in his hometown. We know that John is aware of that quote since he has referenced it in this book, and we covered that last time. But uniquely among the Gospels, when Mark presents this saying, he has Jesus say, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his relatives. Matthew and Luke don't mention the relatives. And Mark also has a unique scene where Jesus' family is trying to detain him under the Hellenistic Baker Act. He says that one time Jesus was in a house, and when his own people heard, they went out to take custody of him because they were saying he has lost his senses. And this is essentially a reference to an Old Testament trope. It could also be Mark trying to literally illustrate Jesus' saying about having to leave behind your father and mother and brothers and farm and everything else. But in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus' relatives, at least early on, are not treating him with any kind of respect. And in the Gospel of John, Jesus' brothers don't believe in him. And that's what John explicitly says. And in fact, they're even somewhat villainous. They encourage Jesus to go back to Judea to perform his miracles publicly, right after the narrator had just said that Jesus might have gotten killed if he went to Judea. Other than mentioning them as being in the background a few times, this is all that John has to tell us about Jesus' brothers. So what kind of independent tradition did he have access to that gave him alternative versions of most of the stories in the other Gospels, some of which very closely follow the wording of Mark in particular, and yet we learn next to nothing about Jesus' family members from John? We learn next to nothing about the disciples. And whatever new things John does manage to tell us about them here and there are mutually exclusive with what the synoptics say about them, to the point where you almost can't trust him as a source of genuine information. And this thing with the brothers, John had noted that Mark depicted them negatively, and he carried that forward into his own book, and maybe even turned up the negativity a notch. After all, what does John care about Jesus' brothers? Now, there's actually another additional source that John could be referencing here when he has the brothers enthusiastically urging Jesus to court death by appearing in public. It's the lost gospel of the Nazarenes, which we mentioned earlier. There's a scene that was supposedly in that book that's somewhat similar to this. Now, I have to warn you, our source for this information is brother of the show, Saint Jerome, so you know what that means. You're about to be confused to the point of tears. Quote, "In the Gospel according to the Hebrews, which is written in the Chaldee and Syrian language, but in Hebrew characters, and is used by the Nazarenes to this day, I mean the Gospel according to the Apostles, or, as is generally maintained, the Gospel according to Matthew, a copy of which is in the library at Caesarea." Did you get all that from this moron? And he goes on to quote from the book as follows. "Our Lord's mother and his brothers said to him, 'John the Baptist baptizes for the remission of sins. Let's go and get baptized by him.' But he said to them, 'What sin have I committed that I should go and be baptized by him? Unless maybe the words that I just said are only ignorance.'" End quote. See, that author, he shouldn't have added that last part. He's trying to be too clever there. But yeah, the brothers urging him to go travel and go and do something that's of religious significance, and his refusal on the grounds that he has a better understanding of religion than they do. It's possibly a parallel to the sequence here in this lost book. And you saw that Jerome, in his infinite wisdom, referred to the book as the Gospel of the Hebrews, and he also implied that it was a variant of Matthew. And that speaks to the confusion that surrounds a lot of these lost Gospels that have similar titles. In episode 19 and episode 30, I said that these lost books are indeed variants of Matthew, in the sense that Matthew is part of the same family of text as they are. Now, I don't think that this lost book that Jerome is referencing necessarily goes all the way back to like the 130s AD, but I would definitely say that more than one book from this Matthew family was circulating at the time John was writing, including the variant Matthew that I believe Justin Martyr to have had. So it is possible that John could have found the inspiration for this short scene from one of those obscure books. But moving on. Jesus now goes to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles, and he teaches in the temple because John knows that teaching in the temple was something that Jesus did because John read the other Gospels. But John has an advantage over the other Gospels in presenting this teaching because the others have it all take place very briefly at the end after the temple cleansing, whereas by moving the temple cleansing back towards the beginning and having it ultimately be inconsequential, John is now free to have Jesus teach in the temple as much as he wants. Having said all that, I don't think that teaching is really the best term to describe what Jesus is doing in these scenes. Really what he does is get into a 45-page long argument with the Jews, and the argument is actually a discourse in disguise. It's an excuse for John to insert another one of these interminable speeches. And that's another way you can tell that John got this concept of teaching in the temple from the other Gospels. These aren't lessons that Jesus has given them. He's not expounding on the Torah and issuing his opinion on why the Bible mentions female camels in this passage as opposed to male camels. He's just talking about himself and repeating the same pseudo-hermetic mantras that he usually does. So John doesn't have any independent tradition about the subjects of Jesus' teachings when he was in the temple. He saw the mention of teaching in the other Gospels, and he used that as like a launching pad to go off in his own direction. And I said that this is just another long speech, but this one in particular is remarkable. It's barely coherent. In this one, Jesus is behaving like a wind-up toy or a Teddy Ruxpin, where he's just spouting various unconnected phrases like, "If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing." or I honor my Father and you dishonor me. But just like with the flesh-eating speech, John still manages to sneak in material from the synoptics. The first example of that is something we mentioned earlier. When Jesus begins talking, the Jews say that they're astonished at his great learning, despite his lack of education. And we called that the education comment, and we talked about how variations of it show up in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. But in there, the people who say it are already familiar with Jesus. They're locals from his hometown. Here in John, the people who say it barely know who Jesus even is, and that's how you can tell that John lifted this line from the other books. Another detail here is something we can learn from Rudolf Bultmann. At the end of this giant monologue, the narrator says that Jesus had spoken these words in the treasury as he taught in the temple. And the term treasury of the temple is often used by ancient authors to describe the treasury in its abstract sense, like how we would say, I took money out of the bank, and that would make sense even if you didn't physically go to the bank. I'm sure there's an official term for that kind of usage. I'm sure someone is silently screaming it out right now while listening to this, but that's how the term treasury of the temple is often used by the ancient authors. 1st and 2nd Maccabees use it that way, for example. The book of Nehemiah uses it that way. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is sitting with the disciples, and they see an old woman putting a modest amount of money, quote, into the treasury. Luke picked up this story from Mark, but he removed one detail, which is where Mark had said that Jesus and the disciples were sitting, quote, opposite the treasury. So in Mark, the treasury is both a single physical space and an abstract notion. They sat opposite the treasury, and they watched the woman put money into the treasury. Luke, for some reason, removes the characterization of the treasury of the Second Temple as a physical space. And to find out why, we can look at the writings of Josephus that mention the Second Temple. Josephus is essentially the primary and most important source for Judea in the 1st century, according to the theologians. When they tell us that the reason they're so qualified to be authorities in this field, we aren't, is because they have a comprehensive knowledge of the historical background of 1st century Judaism and the religious thought world that Jesus was born into. And what they basically mean by that is that they have read the Josephus books and, to a much lesser extent, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because with the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's really difficult for them to come to a consensus on like so many of the various topics that are related to them. With Josephus, there isn't nearly as much difficulty. And so the scholarly knowledge of Josephus is a big part of the value added that the mainstream biblical scholars see themselves as having. Well, if we ourselves now turn to this extraordinarily reliable witness that we have in Josephus, we find that he does talk about the temple treasury in its abstract sense, yet when he describes it as a physical space, he indicates that it had multiple chambers. So there doesn't seem to have been one dedicated area called the treasury in the temple where many people could be sitting or standing at the same time. Now, when John says that Jesus was standing in the treasury, he could be describing the area that was right around the alms box, but it would still be odd to call that the treasury. It just seems that John, who, if you don't know, by the way, is supposed to be the guy who has first-hand knowledge of the Jerusalem temple, since he refers to the pool of Bethesda in the present tense, it just seems that John replicated Mark's mistake about Jesus standing or sitting in a place called the treasury. Another major thing that I wanted to talk about in this scene happens when the Jews here in the temple disagree over whether Jesus is the Messiah. Some of them believe that he is, based on the signs that he's performed. Others disagree, and that would include the chief priests and the Pharisees. Their primary grounds for not believing in him are that he isn't a descendant of David, and he's from Galilee instead of Bethlehem, and Bethlehem is in Judea, not Galilee. And poor Nicodemus tries to stand up for Jesus, and the Pharisees scoff at him. They tell him, "Search and see that no prophet arises out of Galilee," which is not true, actually. Jonah was from Galilee, for example. But maybe they mean that the Messiah won't arise from Galilee because they might be conflating the Messiah with the eschatological prophet. And that would make sense because right before this, we were told about that division among the Jews, the one where some of them believed Jesus to be the Messiah and others disagreed because he wasn't from Bethlehem. Now, this seems fairly significant. Could it indicate that John has no knowledge of the tradition that Jesus was born in Bethlehem? If that's the case, then it might suggest that John did not know the Gospels of Matthew or Luke, since those books depict Jesus as being born in Bethlehem. And so to examine this, let's look at the scenario that's being presented here. We have some first century Jews arguing about Jesus being the Messiah, and some of them are saying that he can't be the Messiah because he wasn't born in Bethlehem. So the question is, and remember that the thesis that we're opposing is that the author of John was relying on independent tradition, which was mostly based on oral tradition that went back to the 20s and 30s AD and the life and ministry of Jesus. The question is, did normative first century Jews, which is what John is depicting here, did they believe that the Messiah would come from Bethlehem? And I said normative so that no one can immediately say that, yeah, some first century Jews did believe that because the first Christians were first century Jews. That's just sophistry. As it turns out, we don't actually know whether it was a popular belief among first century Jews that the Messiah would come from Bethlehem, because the earliest attestation for that belief in Jewish sources comes from much later documents, way later than the usual cutoff that the theologians impose when they say that a document is too late to be relevant. Like if we try to say that this Summer Harvest by Valentinus is relevant to the origins of Christianity, they say, that's from the middle of the 2nd century. That's way too late to have an impact. Well, the earliest normative Jewish source that says that the Messiah will come from Bethlehem is from the 300s. It is indeed the Christians who were the first to make this claim, and they base it on a mongrelized version of a passage from Micah that was part of the testimony book. In his commentary on the Gospel of John, the scholar C.K. Barrett points out that in Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, where Justin's character and the Jewish character spend a great deal of time arguing about the Messiah, it is only Justin's character who brings up the birthplace of the Messiah as Bethlehem, and the Jewish character, Trypho, lets it pass without comment. But I would actually add something to C.K. Barrett's observation here, which is that Trypho does at one point give his opinion on where the Messiah will come from. He says no one knows where he'll come from, and it's very telling that the Gospel of John, amidst all the chaos of this disjointed dialogue, at one random point, John has the Jews say, "We know where this man is from, but whenever the Christ may come, no one knows where he is from." So that would seem to be a more accurate reflection of the Jewish belief. The Messiah's birthplace will be unknown, and presumably it'll be Elijah who will eventually point him out at the right time. Yet these same Jews who just said here in the Gospel of John that no one will know where the Messiah comes from, a few lines after that are saying that everyone knows that the Messiah will come from Bethlehem. And the thing is, the mere fact that Bethlehem is being mentioned at all is in itself a sign that we have passed far beyond the confines of normative Judaism and are now firmly within a Christian thought world. The author of John, who probably did accept that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, presumably because he read that in Matthew or Luke or both, probably recognized, A, that some of the Jews in those Gospels recognized the Micah verse as saying that the Christ would be born in Bethlehem. I mean, think of the chief priests and scribes from Matthew's birth narrative. And B, that none of John's actual Jewish contemporaries in real life seemed to share that belief, and so he split the difference by having the Jews in his story voice both opinions. Now, as for why they would say that Jesus wasn't born in Bethlehem, I think it's just basic dramatic irony. Whether John had learned about Jesus' birthplace from Matthew or from Luke, in either case, he would have seen that Bethlehem was only relevant in the first year or so of Jesus' life. Jesus hardly spends any time there in either gospel. In fact, Matthew's birth narrative even provides a cover as to why no one knew that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. It's because Herod the Great had every child of a certain age executed, but he did that in secret. So the Jewish authorities 30 years later perhaps would have been in the know about that, and so regardless of what they might think about Jesus, they know that he isn't the Messiah, or they don't suspect him to be the Messiah, because he couldn't be the age that he is and have been born in Bethlehem like the Messiah was supposed to be. And the general public would think the same thing, because there would be a vague knowledge or understanding that, Bethlehem's birth rate mysteriously plummeted in like a 2-year period about 30 years ago. So any 30-year-olds wandering around at the time of Jesus were not likely to be from there. I'm not saying that any of those thoughts would ever have occurred to real Jews. I'm just trying to reconstruct Matthew's thought process, such as it was. But the point is, the Jewish crowd in John not knowing that Jesus is from Bethlehem, it's dramatic irony of a kind that is not uncommon in this book. And of course, John's Christian audience could have smirked at the ignorance of the crowd here for not having the insider information that they had. But moving on. I wanted to briefly mention something that we touched on last time. In this same endless dialogue, the Jews repeatedly insist that Jesus has a demon or is demon-possessed. And at one point they say, "Isn't it true that you're a Samaritan and have a demon?" That's the Han Solo scruffy-looking nerf herder sequence, because Jesus only denied the one thing. He denied having a demon. He didn't deny being a Samaritan. And we covered that last time, and I said that I would explain why John didn't have Jesus bother to refute the Samaritan charge here and only focus on the demon charge. It's because this whole segment is really just a rehash of the Beelzebul controversy from the Synoptic Gospels. And that's where Jesus becomes known for his exorcisms, and the Jewish authorities accuse him of being in league with the demons, or they accuse him of only being able to throw out demons through the power of Beelzebul, the prince of demons. The Beelzebul controversy has kind of a complex history in terms of reconstructing its original social environment. What we can say here is that it reflects the experiences of the wandering exorcists of the kingdom preaching movement. Now, I say experiences, but it's more like reflections on experiences, because this is really just a list of possible comebacks that they came up with after the fact to the accusation that they were in league with demons. It's actually just 3 or 4 unconnected responses to that accusation that are listed one after the other. The first one is it's where they plagiarize Abraham Lincoln and they say, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." And then they give some other possible responses. And this list of potential comebacks ultimately was turned into a controversy story involving Jesus. Now, in the Gospel of John, as we know, the author has apparently banned Jesus from doing any exorcisms, but we get an extended series of references to demonic possession here because John is pulling from this Beelzebul controversy sequence. Now, it is possible to assume that the historical Jesus was accused in real life of being possessed by a demon or being in league with demons, and that was a controversy that he had to navigate. And the authors of the Synoptic Gospels might have learned about that through one stream of tradition, and John learned about it through a different stream. But as I said, I just think that John is adapting the Beelzebul controversy from the other Gospels, because the way that the Jesus of John responds to the accusation of having a demon is verbal and rhetorical, and in fact, John incorporates it into the existing dialogue. And if we imagine all the various responses that someone might give if they were accused of being possessed by a demon, how likely is it that the response they give would just be like a calm, collected, rhetorical rejoinder with no emotion whatsoever? Yet somehow that's what John and the Synoptics both represent. And also the Synoptics, they don't actually have Jesus specifically rebut the charge. He rebuts it only by implication. And that's because the exorcists of the kingdom preaching movement probably recognized that simply saying, "No, I am not in league with the demons," was not an effective response to an accusation. And John may have disliked how unemphatic Jesus' denial was, so in his version, he has him categorically deny it. "I don't have a demon." But let's move to the next topic. This dialogue section does eventually end, but just to demonstrate how artificial this whole middle section of John really is, once it does end, we get the miracle story of Jesus healing the blind man that we looked at last time, only to then immediately find ourselves in yet another dialogue scene. But we're going to make the most of it because instead of focusing too closely on the specifics here, I want to bring up an important sign that the Gospel of John is derivative of the Synoptics, and that is the "I am" sayings. These are short sentences where Jesus briefly describes himself in a religiously significant way. "I am the bread of life," and so on. And it has been recognized for some time that these sayings have parallels with sayings in the other Gospels, and sometimes they are parallel to Jesus' descriptions of the kingdom of God. And we know that the kingdom of God is very seldom mentioned in the Gospel of John. Perhaps these "I am" sayings were intended to supplant those mentions of the kingdom of God. We can look at Raymond Brown's commentary, where he lists a few of those connections. We can add some of our own. In the other Gospels, Jesus says that the kingdom of God is like leaven being mixed with flour and working its way through the dough. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says, "I am the bread of life." In the other Gospels, Jesus talks about the shepherd who leaves the 99 sheep behind to find the one who went astray. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep." And he says that the good shepherd calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. In the other Gospels, the kingdom of God is represented as a vineyard that's taken away from its tenants and given to those who deserve the fruit of the vineyard. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says, "I am the true vine." The Gospel of Luke, "Enter through the narrow door, because many will seek to enter and won't be able." The Gospel of John, "I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he'll be saved." Sometimes the effect can be comical. The Gospel of Matthew, "You are the light of the world." The Gospel of John, "I am the light of the world." And this monologue in this section of John here is where he mentions being the good shepherd and being the door. So this is why we covered the I am sayings here. It's hard to understand how John managed to miss all the parables and descriptions of the kingdom of God from Jesus' career, and the thing about the 99 sheep and the leaven, but nonetheless had access to an astonishingly similar list of sayings whose main difference from the other ones was that they placed much more of the focus on Jesus himself. So I think we can go ahead and say that at least some of these reflect John's knowledge of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now on this, the Christ mythicist Earl Doherty had a good point about these I am sayings. And he said that they may have originally been sayings that the members of John's community, even though community is now a curse word among theologians, as we said, but John's community came up with these sayings and applied it to their object of worship, which was basically a heavenly Jesus who had never been on earth. And Earl Doherty, while he does believe that John knew the other Gospels, his view of how the Gospel of John was composed is quite different from mine, but he says that all of these sayings have been historicized by the author and made to look as if they were originally said by Jesus. And I'm paraphrasing, but he said that that's why Jesus seems like such a megalomaniac in the Gospel of John. Because he's issuing sayings that others originally said and applied to him to exalt him, but now he's saying them about himself. And Earl Doherty's point was that a literary technique like that is a possible hint that the author of John intended for his gospel to be taken as entirely symbolic. And the fact that he didn't include most of the teachings of Jesus that are found in the Synoptics may indicate that he not only didn't see those teachings as the product of a historical man, but very crucially, he may have recognized that the Synoptic authors invented those teachings for the very same reason that he was inventing these I am sayings to exalt Jesus. So in other words, John recognizes that this is all fake. So why not take these things from the other books that I like and omit or correct or attack the things that I don't like? And it's important to emphasize that point because one thing that comes up a lot when you say that John knew the other Gospels, those who disagree with that would question why John didn't seem to care that he was omitting or changing so many things from the other Gospels. Like, did he not respect those books? I mean, he was a Christian. If he knew about those books, then he very likely would have taken them seriously. But if we see the author of John as recognizing that the other gospel authors were fabricators just like he was, then it becomes very plausible that he would omit or change so many things. The key, as usual with things on this show, is to not be afraid to see the ancient Christians as potentially acting in bad faith. Now, the next major element that we're going to cover in John is the raising of Lazarus. And between now and then, we're just going to do a few quick hits. And the first one is very brief. I'm not even officially submitting it as a sign that John is derivative. I'm just presenting it for your consideration. It says that at the time of the Feast of Dedication, Jesus was walking in the temple in Solomon's portico, which Solomon's portico was a major setting in the early chapters of Acts of the Apostles. It's where the earliest Christians would originally gather together. And much more to the point, Peter and John heal a disabled man at the temple gates, and it's a man who had been disabled from his mother's womb, just as Jesus at this point in the Gospel of John has just healed a man who's been blind from birth. Now, it's a little confusing because the author of John is not especially clear on the time frame here, but sequentially, Jesus then addresses a major speech to a Jewish audience at the Portico of Solomon, just as Peter delivers a major speech to a Jewish audience there after the healing that he did. This might be an indication that John was aware of Acts of the Apostles, especially when you consider other small things like what we mentioned in the opening reading last time about the royal official who believed in Jesus along with his whole household, which is reminiscent of some of the pagan characters in Acts, and the thing from earlier about how Jesus told Peter that he had no part with him. If I had to speculate as to why John would have adapted the scenario from Acts with Peter's speech, I would guess that, Peter's speech, it does dramatically upstage a lot of what Jesus did in Jerusalem in the Synoptics, at least from a rhetorical standpoint. I remember I watched some movie that the first half was the life of Jesus and the second half was basically Acts of the Apostles. It was a movie from the 1970s AD. And the Peter speech was actually one of the better scenes in that movie. And so because of that, I would say there's no reason to doubt that John recognized the dramatic impact of that scene from Acts. And so he wanted to do an even better scene where Jesus was the star. And next we have another quick hit. The Jews pick up stones to throw at Jesus, even though to me, it seemed like he was doing a pretty good job of avoiding the word Jehovah. He was consistently saying my father instead, but I wasn't there, so who knows if we're getting the full picture. But this is kind of funny. They get ready to stone him, and he says, I showed you many good works from the Father. Which of them are you stoning me for? So a little manipulative reverse psychology from the pre-existent logos who existed before the ages there. And the Jews respond by saying, we aren't stoning you for a good work, numbnuts. We're stoning you for blasphemy. And because you, a man, are making yourself out to be God. Now, everyone knows that the charge of blasphemy that the high priest levies against Jesus in the Synoptics is questionable. It wouldn't be blasphemy if he said that he was the Messiah. But here in John, it seems that the Jews are accusing Jesus of blasphemy because he made himself out to be God, presumably because he just said, I and the Father are one. It's not actually clear that that would have been considered blasphemy either, but I'm highlighting this exchange because I think it's an example of John showing knowledge of the other Gospels, and there's two reasons for that. One is that John might recognize that the blasphemy charge in the trial in, say, Mark was not legitimate. And John may already know at this point that he's not actually going to have the Jews in his gospel make any specific accusation during the trial itself. And so this is his way of explaining what Jesus is ultimately going to be found guilty of by the religious authorities. It's blasphemy because he equated himself with God. The second reason why I think this shows John's knowledge of the other Gospels is he seems to be influenced by something from a different part of Mark here in the view of blasphemy that he's taking. Because early on in Mark, in the story about the healing of the paralytic, which John also knows, as we established last time, the Pharisees say that Jesus is blaspheming because he told the guy that his sins were forgiven, and no one can forgive sins except God. So I think John has adopted this concept of Jesus being condemned for blasphemy, but he's given more of a foundation to that charge. And he probably actually wonders why Mark didn't apply that same logic of blasphemy from the paralytic story to his trial scene, instead of weirdly having the authorities accuse Jesus of blasphemy simply for saying that he was the Messiah. That's neither here nor there. But we have one more quick hit before we get to the Lazarus Miracle. In this general section where Jesus is delivering these monologues, there are literally 5 occasions where the crowd tries to seize him, but it says that he eluded their grasp. At one point, it even says that he was hidden. And John says that they weren't able to seize him because his hour hadn't yet come. Now, I talked before about how John, at this point in the book, has more speech material than he has narrative material. And we talked about some of the problems that created for him. Another problem it creates is that given the situation we're presented with, in which Jesus is now repeatedly saying provocative things in front of a hostile crowd, it becomes more and more implausible that nothing bad ever seems to happen to him. It's as if John is having him do a temple cleansing over and over again with no consequences. But John absolutely has to have him give these speeches, and so the only recourse that John has is to have Jesus just keep disappearing like a ninja. The Jewish audience that he's talking to has probably been conditioned by now. The second that Jesus says something inane, like, I am older than Abraham, then you better cover your eyes and your mouth because he is about to drop the Assassin's Creed smoke bomb from Assassin's Creed 2, Brotherhood. Why is John resorting to this lame deus ex machina over and over again? Well, John, as I've hopefully established, did not have access to any substantive independent tradition about Jesus, because think about it. If Jesus was anything like what the Gospels portray, and he said controversial things that clashed with the general understanding of Judaism, then he would have gotten into many, many disputes. And some of those disputes may have turned violent. And the tradition would have preserved various stories about Jesus causing trouble and then getting out of trouble by escaping. Yet there are effectively 0 such stories. And ironically, Celsus, the pagan critic of Christianity, is one of the few sources that does preserve a hint of that kind of story when he says that Jesus ended up in hiding, but his disciples betrayed him, and that's how he got executed. And who knows where he got that from, possibly a polemical source from rabbinic Judaism. But John did not have access to a source like that. What he had access to was the synoptic gospels, such as the Gospel of Luke, where early on, Jesus upsets the Jewish audience in the synagogue with his religious teaching, just like here in John, where he does that same thing in the temple. In Luke, the audience gets so angry that they try to throw him off the nearby mountain or hill, which nearby is being generous if we're talking about the real Nazareth, but that also is neither here nor there. The point is, in Luke, Jesus passes through their midst and goes on his way. So Luke was facing the same problem that John was. He wanted to create a tense scene where Jesus was potentially in danger, but he was obviously never in any real danger. We already know that John is familiar with this Nazareth scene from Luke because earlier we talked about how he had adapted some of the dialogue from it, what we call the lineage comment. Isn't that Joseph's son? And so John also adapted the literary device that he found here of getting Jesus out of a tight spot by turning him into Alex Mack, turning into a puddle, sliding away from a threat, GC 161. And John is so unoriginal and had so little outside input from other sources or other traditions that he went on to use this literary device over and over. But now we finally get to the most well-known miracle story in John, the Raising of Lazarus. In all of early Christian literature, the Raising of Lazarus is the best written miracle story, and it's also the most dramatic. I did say in episode 25 that it's still quite lacking in terms of pathos, but that's true of all such stories from early Christianity. But the Raising of Lazarus is a striking tale, and you would therefore think that it would be talked about a lot more in discussions about the historical Jesus and employed a lot more regularly in Christian apologetics. I mean, Jesus raised a guy from the dead, with who knows how many witnesses here. I mean, this would be much more effective of an apologetic than the empty tomb, because there could be so many alternate explanations for the empty tomb. Like maybe Jesus' burial place was changed at the last minute, like in that book, The Master and Margarita. But here with the Lazarus story, the entire town witnessed the miracle, including Jesus' enemies. I mean, why would they lie about what they saw? So that's something to think about. But the story of Lazarus, it starts when Jesus gets an email from the two sisters of Lazarus, Mary and Martha. And they say their brother is sick, and Jesus says that he'll come down and awaken Lazarus from sleep, and he and the disciples eventually head down there to Bethany, the real Bethany, which is near Jerusalem, and that'll become important later. He gets there, he has some dialogue with the two sisters, a crowd gathers, Jesus cries out with a loud voice, Lazarus comes out bound with wrappings. I'm somewhat oversimplifying because this story is disjointed in more than one place, as if it seemingly went through 2 or 3 rewrites. For example, it seems like the author has Jesus approach the tomb twice. But it has long been pointed out that Lazarus, Mary, and Martha are all names that show up in the Gospel of Luke. And the question is, if John followed Luke, or the Proto-Luke, then what was his intent here in using these names? Now, conservative scholars don't like the idea that John took the 3 names from Luke, and they say that the Lazarus character appears in Luke in a wildly different context than in John, and it also seems strange to them that when Jesus encountered Mary and Martha in Luke, that nothing was said about Lazarus on that occasion. So they say that John and Luke are working off of separate traditions about these people, but that's a losing battle in my view. Because it is inexplicable that the Synoptic Gospels don't know about the raising of Lazarus. I mean, even if you don't accept that John knew the other Gospels, you would really have to concede that the raising of Lazarus is the closest we can get to absolute proof that John came after those other books for that reason. There's no explanation for Mark, Matthew, and Luke not knowing about the raising of Lazarus. So it would appear that John invented the story and that he indeed got the character names from Luke. The question remains as to what was his purpose in inventing the story. And in episode 33, I talked about how John moved the temple cleansing all the way back to the beginning of Jesus' ministry so that we, as readers, wouldn't fall into the error of assuming that Jesus was arrested and executed because of the temple cleansing. Beating up the worshippers in the temple, along with the innocent money changers, and beating up the animals, including the defenseless birds, that would be something that a traditional Messiah candidate would do. That would be what Bar Kokhba would do. Jesus did it because the testimony book required him to do it, but the author of John is not going to let that event become more significant than it has to be. Instead, as a pretext to Jesus getting arrested and executed, John invents the story of Lazarus. The raising of Lazarus has become the new temple cleansing, and it happens in the same town of Bethany that was where the Passion narrative began. That's where Jesus was based. I mean, Bethany was the Tora Bora from which he committed his terrorist attack on the Jewish temple in the Passion narrative. And one of the most important passages in the Gospel of John, and really in all the Gospels, that also hardly ever gets talked about, it's worth looking at. It's John 12:16 through 12:22. John has just completed his version of the triumphal entry on the donkey, which we'll talk about next time. And John has given us an actual rationale for Jesus to have been hailed by throngs of enthusiastic people, which is that they heard about the Lazarus miracle, and now they want to see the man who did it. The crucial moment is when some Greeks appear, and they go to Philip and they tell him that they want to meet Jesus. When Philip then goes to Jesus and tells him about these Greeks, he says, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." Nothing ever happens with the Greeks. The author just forgets about them, but this is actually the turning point of the entire book. Now Jesus can be crucified because he's completed his mission, since the whole world now knows about him, at least potentially. Now, why didn't the Greeks get to actually meet him? I said that John forgot about it. Really, it's because of what I said last time in the opening reading. Remember that the apostles were supposed to be the ones who spread Christianity to the Gentiles. In theory, no Gentile was ever given a good enough reason to become a believer while Jesus was still living. And this is another way that the author of John has skirted around that. The Lazarus miracle was so monumental that it pre-evangelized the entire Gentile world. And why is that important from a narrative standpoint? Why was that the missing element that was preventing John from moving on to the passion sequence until now? It's because the Lazarus miracle was the last chance for the Jewish world to believe in Jesus. In the logic of the author of John, if any Jew didn't believe in Jesus after he raised Lazarus from the dead, then they were never going to believe in Jesus. And I've mentioned Acts of the Apostles a few times, and I think it's only slightly possible that John knew Acts of the Apostles, but this is very much a trope from Acts of the Apostles. We went to the Jews, we got some converts, the majority rejected us, now we're going to the pagans. And we'll just note that connection in passing. But I said that in John's mind, if a Jewish person didn't believe in Jesus after seeing him raise Lazarus from the dead, then he's never going to believe in Jesus. Now, how does John know that? Well, in the Gospel of Luke, he read the parable of the poor man and the rich man, and Lazarus was the name of the poor man. Him and the rich man both die, and the rich man is getting tormented while Lazarus is getting rewarded and gets to be with Abraham. The rich man begs Abraham to send Lazarus back to the living world so that he can warn the rich man's family members to shape up. And Abraham refuses, and he says, if they don't even listen to Moses and the prophets, they won't be persuaded even if someone rises from the dead. And that's a line that clearly would have resonated with John. In fact, that is more of a Johannine idea than a Lucan idea. And so the raising of Lazarus does fulfill an important narrative function, but ultimately it's just a clever midrash on a single line from the Gospel of Luke. Now, the connection between the Lazarus parable in Luke and the Lazarus story in John, for anyone who wants John to be independent, it's necessary for them to downplay that connection. And the theologian Percival Gardner Smith deals with that problem by using the famous 5 words. He said there's no reason to suppose that John read the parable of Lazarus and the rich man from Luke. By the way, over the course of this whole podcast, you've heard me mention the 5 words a lot, which is technically it's 6 words. How ridiculous is it to say that there's no reason to doubt something? Like, no reason to doubt? How could there be no reason to doubt? It sounds like what a hypnotist would say while they're putting you into a trance. Now, just briefly, I mentioned that this story seems disjointed in places, and I think that's just human error on the part of the author. One example happens at the beginning when Jesus first gets the news that Lazarus is sick, and then he stays where he is for 2 days and doesn't go anywhere. And after the 2 days, he says to the disciples, let's go to Judea, because now he's going to go raise Lazarus. And the disciples are shocked, like, you're going to go back there where everyone's trying to kill you? And he responds to them with another riddle. But the general sense we get from him is that he's determined. Like, why wouldn't I go back to Judea? And the great radical critic Bruno Bauer said that this is really just a reference to the Gospel of Mark, the part right after Peter's confession where Jesus predicts his own death. And Peter is upset by this prediction, and Jesus not only rebukes Peter and says that he's going to go through with it, but he issues some vaguely relevant teachings on the subject of denying oneself and sacrificing oneself. And that's why this part of the Lazarus tale from John seems like it was weirdly edited here. In order to adapt that passage from Mark, John had to have Jesus learn that Lazarus was sick and then not do anything at first. So it wouldn't look like he was just traveling down to Bethany out of strictly emotional reasons. But then he had to suddenly change his mind and decide to go there a short time later, just so the disciples could set him up with that objection, and John could then pull in some material from Mark for Jesus' response. And speaking of Mark, there's another strange moment at the beginning of the Lazarus story. When the author first names Mary and Martha, we get some director's commentary. This was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, folks. And we're going to talk more about this ointment thing next time, but what I would say for now is that it is not impossible that as John was struggling with putting together the story of Lazarus and was doing his rewrites and additions, that only later in that process did he come up with the idea of giving Lazarus two sisters named Mary and Martha. Because this is how he introduces the story as a whole. A certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha, which is very mysterious phrasing. The women are brought up as being associated with the town, and Mary is said to be the sister of Martha. Like, aren't they all siblings here? And then in their email to Jesus, the sisters tell him, the one whom you love is sick. It's like, are they speaking in code? And then in that director's commentary, he said, it was the Mary who anointed the Lord. That's whose brother was sick. Like, isn't he Martha's brother as well? I will say, though, that line about it was the Mary who anointed the Lord, that exists only so you don't think that Lazarus was Jesus's uncle, right? Or his family member, like the brother of Mary, Jesus's mother. And Jesus' mother, Mary, was the very first topic that we discussed in this series, and I implied that John did know her name from the other Gospels, but he avoided using it for a specific reason. And I think the reason was so that we didn't confuse her with any of the other 900 Marys in the Gospel. But as I said earlier, the sisters Mary and Martha are also characters from the Gospel of Luke. In Luke, they live in a village, which is not said to be Bethany, and logically speaking, I don't think it could be Bethany, but Martha invites Jesus into their home. And while he's there, Martha is distracted with a lot of service, as Luke says, while Mary sits and listens to Jesus. And she sits at his feet, it says. Martha says to Jesus, why does Mary get to sit and do nothing? Tell her to help me. Jesus says, you're worried about so many different things, but Mary has chosen the one necessary good thing. And it's not an accident that this all happens right after the parable of the Good Samaritan, which itself happens right after Jesus said that the way to be saved is to love God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself. It's Luke's version of the greatest commandment dialogue. So it is conceivable that Martha represents those who are too preoccupied with following the letter of the Jewish law and working out their salvation, when there's really only one simple, obvious thing that anyone needs to do, and it's what Mary's doing, which is listening to Jesus. And this would have been a parable that John would have been keenly interested in. And indeed, I think that our own St. Gordon Rylance, was correct in saying that John adapted these characters and these associations that we just talked about from Luke and added them into his Lazarus story to give it an additional layer. And so imagine Martha and John as symbolizing either Jews or Jewish believers in Jesus, and Mary representing the pagan believers, like those all-important Greeks that we encounter practically on the very next page after this. The sequence of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, it begins by saying that Martha went out to meet Jesus, just like she was the one who invited him in the Gospel of Luke, but her sister Mary is still sitting at the house. Martha more or less confronts Jesus, and he reassures her, saying that Lazarus will rise again. And she says, I know, he'll rise during the resurrection. And this is the parody of Peter's confession that we talked about earlier. And she says that she believes that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God. And then it says, when she had said that, she went away and called Mary, her sister, saying secretly, the teacher is here and is calling for you. When she heard it, she gets up quickly and was coming to him. Secretly is quite a word for the author to use here, and if we accept this potential symbolism of what the two women represent, then it makes sense that Mary would indeed be called, which is itself a significant term, but called only secretly. And Martha goes on to express some doubt later in the story, right before Jesus performs the resurrection miracle, but Mary is unquestioning throughout, and some might say faithful. And as John has already mentioned, Mary will end up anointing Jesus later on in an act of obedient service. And it says that she wipes his feet with her hair. And that's also a motif from the Gospel of Luke, in which a woman who's a repentant sinner anoints Jesus' feet. And so if John has inserted the characters of these two sisters for symbolic purposes, and Mary symbolizes the early Christians who were formerly pagans, thus sinners, then John may have naturally hit upon the idea of combining the anointing story from Mark with the anointing story from Luke and have Mary recur in that scene. As I said, we'll talk more about that sequence next time. And Martha and Mary, they need not symbolize the two different cultures, if you will. They could merely symbolize two different types. Those who say that they believe but still require convincing, and those who believe unquestioningly on faith. The one thing that I would urge you to consider is that even if you don't accept this view on the symbolism here, you have to ask yourself what the alternative could be, considering the fact that what John says here about Mary and Martha does not appear to have come from any substantive, independent tradition. These two characters, these sisters who happen to share the same name as two sisters from the Gospel of Luke, the fact that these characters do have that parallel in Luke is the stumbling block that's really going to hinder anyone who wants to posit a traditional background for them that only John, among all four Gospel authors, was aware of. It just seems far more likely that he adapted the characters from Luke and actually continued developing the theme that Luke had already established in his story about them. And the only other thing I wanted to mention about the raising of Lazarus is that language from the empty tomb narrative in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark seems to have drifted all the way up here. In John, when we eventually get to the empty tomb of Jesus, there's no mention of any stone covering the entrance, yet there's a mention of a stone lying against the tomb of Lazarus, and it has to be physically removed before Jesus can raise Lazarus from the dead. So in other words, the material to which John had access was apparently so finite that he had to cannibalize details from Jesus' empty tomb story and transfer them to the Lazarus tomb story. It's kind of similar to what we covered before about how John saw that Jesus magically vanished one time in the Gospel of Luke, and he himself had like 5 instances where he had to get Jesus out of a tight spot, and so he borrowed that concept of vanishing, basically had him vanish 5 times. Things like this are the result of John having very little to work with outside of the Synoptic Gospels. But to set the scene for next time, we'll look at a fairly decent passage in the Gospel of John here for a change. The Jewish authorities reacting to the raising of Lazarus, and that's going to signal the beginning of the Passion sequence. The chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council and were saying, "What are we doing? Because this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, then all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away our place and our nation, maybe even in the upcoming year of 70 AD. Who knows, am I right, folks?" But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it's expedient for you that one man dies for the people and that the whole nation not perish." So from that day on, they plan together to kill him. And in the name of Saint Candida, we will conclude this series in episode 36. Thank you for listening. This criticism is ended. Go in peace.
What other stories of mythology do you think of as historical reality?